Today's video in my HTML series is going to cover the basics of headings and paragraphs in HTML. And shout out to Mozilla Developer Network for a great article on this. So this goes on to say that most structured text consists of headings and paragraphs, whether you're reading a story, newspaper, textbook, magazine, etc. Structured content makes the reading experience easier and more enjoyable. In HTML, each paragraph has to be wrapped in a P element, like so. And then you can see this example here. They have an opening and closing P tag here. Here's the closing, here's the opening, and within that is your content. So this is how you would signify that you want a paragraph in your HTML. And similarly, each header needs to be wrapped in a heading element. So this is an opening H1 tag and a closing H1 tag, and this is your content in between. This would be a header right here. And for headers, there are 6 heading elements. You have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Each element represents a different level of content in the document. H1 represents the main heading. So this is like your top level, most important heading in your document. H1, it's like the big dog of your document. H2 represents subheadings. And then H3 represents subheadings, and so on and so forth. And this allows you to kind of create a structural hierarchy. For example, in this story that I'm going to show you below here, the H1 element represents the title of the story. The H2 elements represent the title of each chapter of the story, and the H3 elements represent subsections of each chapter. So you can see here, if you had a web page and you're kind of telling a story or something, the main header, the title of the story, would be your H1 right at the top. And usually a web page is probably only going to have one H1, or that is a common way to structure things. And then here, the author's name, it's not necessarily a heading, so they just use a paragraph text here. And then they have a chapter right here, and they wrap it with an H2. So this is kind of a subheading. Not quite as important as the main title, but still pretty important. Then they have a paragraph here, another H2 because it's another chapter title. So they do a good job of keeping it consistent. All chapter titles have these H2 headings here. Then they have some more text in a paragraph here. And then they have a subsection in which they wrap it in H3. So most important is the title. Second most important is the chapters. And then third most important is the subsections. And they create this structural hierarchy using these different kind of H1, H2, H3, these different levels to these headers here. And then it goes on to say, it's really up to you what the elements involved represent, as long as the hierarchy makes sense. You just need to bear in mind a few best practices as you create such structures within kind of your HTML. So for one, preferably, you should use a single H1 per page. This is the top level heading, and all other things sit below this hierarchy. So this is kind of what I explained earlier. Most of the time, you're just going to have that one single top level H1 on your web page. Number 2, make sure you use headings in the correct order in the hierarchy. Don't use H3 elements to represent subheadings, followed by H2 elements to represent subheadings. That doesn't make sense and will lead to weird results. And then number 3, of the 6 heading levels available, you should aim to use no more than 3 per page, unless you feel it is necessary. Documents with many levels, for example, a deep heading hierarchy, become unwieldy and difficult to navigate. On such occasions, it is advisable to spread the content over multiple pages if possible. So don't get too crazy with your hierarchy in which you're using a bunch of different like nested structures and stuff like that. And you might be thinking, like, why do we need to structure? Well, they go on to kind of show an example here. And in this example, they don't use a structure. And you see when it gets rendered to the web page, it's just this one big chunk of text here. There's no like this is not super readable. It's just this one long piece of text. And they go on to say this is because there are no elements to give the content structure. So the browser doesn't know what is a heading and what is a paragraph. Furthermore, users looking at a web page tend to scan quickly to find relevant content, just reading headings to begin with. If they can't see anything useful, they'll go somewhere else. So if I go to a page and I just saw one long block of text like this, I'm probably bouncing because I just see a bunch of text that's going to take me a long time to parse, and I'm going to move on with my life. And then here, search engines indexing your page consider the contents of headings as important keywords for influencing the page's search rankings. Without headings, your page will perform poorly in terms of search engine optimization. So if you type some keywords into Google, it's going to use web pages that have headings that are relevant to those search keywords. So if you don't use headings, then Google can't really scrape your web page and know if you have relevant keywords to whatever is being searched. So it becomes way less likely that if someone searches for something on Google, that your page will actually come up because it can't scrape your headings here. Also, severely impaired people often don't read web pages, they listen to them instead. This is done with software called a screen reader, and effectively, if you don't use headings, it makes this much more difficult for these individuals to understand what's going on with your web page, because the screen reader will use your headings and use this information to read things out in a more clear way to this individual. Also, to style content with CSS or to do some interesting things with JavaScript, you need to have your elements wrapped in relevant content. So CSS and JavaScript can effectively target it. So creating a consistent structure will allow you to use something like CSS to select all of your H3 elements, and maybe you want those in like a slightly different font style compared to your H1 elements. Well, if you consistently wrap all of your kind of subheaders within H3, then you can style those by just using one single selector, and it makes things so much easier rather than wrapping some of your subheadings in like an H6, some of them in an H4, so on and so forth. Therefore, having a structure to the markup is a really good idea. And then this goes into, why do we need semantics? Well, semantics are relied on everywhere around us. We rely on previous experience to tell us what the function of everyday object is. When we see something, we know what the function should be. For example, we expect a red traffic light to mean stop and a green traffic light to mean go. Things can get very tricky if there's a wrong application of semantics, like if red traffic lights meant go. In a similar way, we need to make sure we are using correct elements, giving our content the correct meaning, function, or appearance. In this context, the H1 element is also a semantic element, which give the text it wraps around the role or meaning of a top-level heading of the page, or a more important heading on our page. The browser will give this a large font size and make it look like a heading, although you can style it however you want using CSS. So the browser will kind of give your different heading levels different default styles, but don't worry if you don't want to use those styles. You can overwrite that using like an H1 selector or a different selector in CSS and add some custom styles. More importantly, its semantic value will be used in multiple ways, for example, by search engines and screen readers, as we kind of discussed before. On the other hand, you can make any element look like a top-level heading. Consider the following. This is a span element. It has no semantics. You just wrap it in content when you want to apply CSS to it, without giving it any extra meaning. They've applied some styles to it, but it has no semantic value, and it will not get any of the benefits of search engine optimization or helping people screen readers or different things like that. So it's a good idea to use the relevant HTML element for the job. So if you find yourself doing a bunch of stuff like this, like you have text and you're just wrapping it in a span element and you're customizing it that way, it's probably not the best idea. And it's probably much better to use something more semantic, like a paragraph tag or a H4 element or something like that. Okay. So those are the fundamentals of headings and paragraphs. In my next video, we will move on to lists and other HTML concepts.